England, 1820. When a woman refused a duke in front of all of London, no one expected her to become the only woman he could never forget. The grand ballroom of the Duchess of Harrington's residence blazed with candlelight, casting golden shadows across the sea of silk and velvet that filled the chamber. Charlotte Hayes stood near the towering windows overlooking Mayfair, her pale blue gown modest compared to the elaborate displays surrounding her. The dress, though elegantly tailored, bore the mark of economy, tasteful enough to avoid outright criticism, yet unmistakably the work of a provincial seamstress rather than one of London's celebrated modistes. She held her champagne untouched, watching the dancers move through the quadrille with the precision of players in a well-rehearsed performance. "You might at least attempt to appear engaged," her mother murmured, appearing at her elbow, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing her daughter's every movement. Margaret Hayes, the Countess in her own mind, though her husband bore only a Viscount's title, surveyed the ballroom with the intensity of a general assessing battle lines. At 55, she retained the sharp features and sharper tongue that had defined her since youth. Her own gown, deep burgundy trimmed with costly lace, announced her determination to compete with women of higher rank through sheer force of expenditure. "I am quite content observing," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice steady. She had learned years ago that direct disagreement only prolonged her mother's attention, and her mother's attention was invariably uncomfortable. "Content." Margaret's laugh held no warmth. "Content is precisely what has kept you unmarried at 28, Charlotte. Contentment is the luxury of women with options. You have none." Her mother leaned closer, her voice dropping to that particular register she employed when delivering truths she deemed essential. "The Viscount's investments in the Americas have proven disappointing. Your father's income is not what it once was. Your sisters made advantageous matches because they possessed youth and moderate beauty. You possess neither advantage now, and your prospects diminish with each passing season." Charlotte had heard variations of this assessment countless times. Her two younger sisters had married adequately, one to a prosperous merchant's son, the other to a minor baronet. Neither match was particularly distinguished, yet both exceeded what society expected for daughters of a man whose fortune was gradually evaporating. That Charlotte remained unmarried at her age was treated as a personal failure, as though she alone bore responsibility for the family's financial trajectory. "There," Margaret said suddenly, her fingers tightening on Charlotte's arm. "The Duke of Ashford has arrived." The ballroom seemed to shift, though no announcement had been made. Charlotte noticed it first in the dancers, whose steps faltered momentarily before resuming with renewed precision. The chaperones stiffened. Even the orchestra's tempo appeared to accelerate. She turned toward the entrance and understood immediately why such disruption had occurred. The Duke stood framed in the doorway with an air of someone entering territory that bent itself to his presence. Alexander Blackwell, the 5th Duke of Ashford, commanded attention not through ostentation, but through an almost visible aura of consequence. At 35, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that artists attempted to capture and inevitably failed. His face too austere, his gaze too penetrating, his overall demeanor too entirely indifferent to the effect he produced. Dark hair swept back from his forehead revealed sharp features and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore black evening clothes with the simplicity of a man for whom such formality required no consideration. A single diamond pin caught the light at his throat, the only ornament he permitted himself. "He rarely graces private gatherings," Margaret whispered, her earlier criticism of Charlotte entirely forgotten in the face of more pressing concerns. "I had heard he remained at his estate in the country. This is unexpected." Charlotte watched as the Duke moved through the crowd with a detachment that bordered on hostility. Ladies attempted to position themselves in his path, only to find him somehow already beyond them. Lords attempted conversation, managing only brief acknowledgements before he proceeded onward. He appeared to be conducting a systematic survey of the ballroom rather than genuinely socializing. His gaze passed over clusters of people without lingering, assessing each group with the dispassion of someone evaluating livestock at market. Then his eyes found Charlotte. It was not dramatic in the manner of romantic novels her friend Helena secretly read. His attention simply rested upon her, held for a moment longer than others, and then moved away. Yet that moment seemed to stretch, and Charlotte found herself suddenly aware of her own breathing, of the precise weight of the champagne glass in her hand, of the way her hair lay against the nape of her neck. She looked away, directing her attention back toward the dancers, her heart performing an entirely inexplicable acceleration. "He is looking," Margaret breathed, and Charlotte realized her mother had noticed everything. "Charlotte, for heaven's sake, do not slouch. Straighten your posture. Where is your fan? You should be using your fan. The gesture suggests confidence." Charlotte obeyed these directives mechanically, though she was uncertain whether the Duke remained in her vicinity. She felt absurdly exposed, despite being surrounded by hundreds of people, as though a curtain had been drawn back and she had been illuminated in an unflattering light. The musicians transitioned into a new waltz, and the dance floor emptied as couples repositioned themselves. Charlotte expected the Duke to disappear into the crowd or depart entirely, as appeared to be his inclination. Instead, he approached their section of the ballroom with measured steps. "Good evening, Countess," he said, addressing Margaret first, as protocol demanded. His voice carried no warmth, though it contained none of the coldness she might have anticipated. It was simply a voice stating facts. "I trust you are well." Margaret performed an elaborate curtsy that struck Charlotte as undignified. "Your Grace, what an honour. We had not expected the pleasure of your company this evening. I found myself with an evening available," the Duke replied, with a brevity that suggested this was not actually an explanation, but rather a dismissal of the need for one. His attention shifted to Charlotte. "Miss Hayes, I believe we have not been properly introduced, though I have seen you at several gatherings this season." Charlotte suddenly understood why people found conversation with him so difficult. He looked at her with an intensity that seemed to require response, yet offered no guidance as to what response would be appropriate. "We have attended several of the same events, Your Grace, though I confess I spend much of my time observing rather than participating." Something flickered in his expression, though Charlotte could not identify whether it was approval or mild derision. "And what is it that you observe?" The question was innocent enough, yet it felt laden with consequence. He seemed genuinely interested in her answer, which was so unusual that Charlotte found herself speaking with more honesty than she typically employed in society. "The rituals, mostly. The way people perform roles they have been assigned. The extraordinary effort expended to maintain appearances that everyone recognizes as false." Margaret made a small sound of distress beside her. To voice such observations aloud was precisely the sort of social misstep that resulted in a reputation for being difficult, or worse, intellectual. Yet the Duke did not appear offended. If anything, his expression suggested he recognized himself in her description. "A rather bleak assessment," he observed. "And is there nothing genuine in your observations of our society?" "Very little," Charlotte admitted. She had stepped over some boundary she knew. Tomorrow her mother would spend hours attempting to undo this conversation. Yet in this moment, with this man looking at her as though she were a person rather than a piece of eligible inventory, she could not seem to produce the bland pleasantries that would be more prudent. The Duke proceeded to ask her questions about her reading, her opinions on the new architectural designs appearing in London, and her thoughts on the proposed changes to Parliament. It was the most sustained attention she had received from any gentleman in years, and also the first conversation she had engaged in, where she felt no compulsion to diminish herself or pretend to be less interesting than she was. They spoke through 2 subsequent dances. Margaret stood nearby, her expression shifting between triumph and anxiety. When the evening progressed toward its conclusion, the Duke conducted Charlotte and Margaret to the centre of the ballroom, where the orchestra was preparing for the final sets. The crowd seemed to sense something significant approaching. People repositioned themselves to observe better. Conversations died away to whispers. "Miss Hayes," Alexander said, and his voice carried clearly through the suddenly attentive silence. "I find myself compelled to inquire whether you might consider sharing your life with me in a more permanent capacity. I am in need of a wife, and you, it appears, are in need of someone who recognizes your value rather than dismisses it." It was not a question posed on bended knee. It was not accompanied by poetry or theatrical demonstration. It was simply stated, as though he were requesting her assessment of the weather. And yet, the entire ballroom froze, understanding immediately that something momentous had occurred. The Duke of Ashford, whose name appeared in gossip columns primarily in relation to his refusal of advantageous matches, had proposed to a woman of unremarkable family and modest prospects. Charlotte's mother gripped her arm so forcefully that pain shot through her shoulder. She could feel the weight of 200 gazes. She understood that this moment would define her life in ways she could scarcely calculate. Here stood security for her family, elevation in status, escape from the slow diminishment of her circumstances. Here stood everything her mother had sacrificed her own identity to achieve. And here stood a cage, however gilded, however well-intentioned its construction. "Your Grace," Charlotte heard herself say, "I cannot accept your proposal." The words seemed to hang in the ballroom like a physical object. Margaret made a strangled sound. The Duke's expression transformed into something unreadable, though his jaw tightened visibly. Society held its collective breath, uncertain whether it had truly witnessed what it believed it had witnessed. "Might I inquire as to your reasoning?" he asked, his voice now carrying an edge it had lacked moments before. "You require a wife based on a single evening's conversation about philosophy and architecture. I require a partnership based on genuine affection rather than mutual convenience. I will not trade my independence for security. I have watched my mother do precisely that, and I will not repeat her mistake." Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest, and she was aware that she had just accomplished something irreversible. She had refused a duke. She had humiliated him before all of society. She had destroyed any possibility of this particular escape route. The Duke bowed formally, though Charlotte saw the muscle working in his jaw. "I see. Then I wish you every success in locating a more suitable match." He departed the ballroom moments later. By morning, the entire of London would be discussing what had transpired. By the following week, the story would transform into a minor scandal. The woman who had rejected the Duke of Ashford would become a subject of endless speculation, scrutiny, and judgment. What Charlotte did not yet understand was that she had also become something else entirely. She had become unforgettable to the one man in all of England who had never before been denied anything. The morning following the ball proved far more consequence-laden than Charlotte had anticipated. She awoke to find her mother positioned outside her bedchamber door like a sentinel, her expression conveying a rage so profound that it seemed to permeate the very air of the Hayes townhouse. Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, emerged as something between a hiss and a whisper, as though she lacked the composure to raise her voice to its customary volume. "You have destroyed yourself," Margaret said simply. "More significantly, you have destroyed this family. The Duke of Ashford does not receive rejections. Men of his stature do not experience such indignities and simply retreat. By tomorrow evening, every drawing room in London will be discussing your refusal. By next week, you will be regarded as unbalanced or deranged. By the season's conclusion, you will be entirely unmarriageable." Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her nightdress, her hair unbound and tangled. She had not slept. Instead, she had spent the night examining every moment of the previous evening, questioning whether her refusal had been an act of principle or merely an expression of cowardice disguised as integrity. The more she reconsidered, the less certain she became. "I could not accept a proposal based on a single evening's acquaintance," Charlotte attempted to explain, though the words felt inadequate, even as she spoke them. A marriage requires financial stability and social elevation," Margaret interrupted sharply. "Everything else is secondary and negotiable. Your father's circumstances have deteriorated significantly. The investments he made in the Americas will not yield the returns we anticipated. In fact, they will yield nothing. We are, Charlotte, approaching genuine financial difficulty." This revelation struck with the force of unexpected disaster. Charlotte had known her family's fortunes were modest, but she had not realized they were actively declining. The implications cascaded through her mind: reduced social standing, smaller household, eventual necessity of leaving London entirely. Everything her mother had labored to maintain, every sacrifice extracted from Charlotte in pursuit of her younger sister's advantageous marriages, had been in service of a fortune that was simultaneously evaporating. How soon? Charlotte asked quietly. That depends entirely upon events beyond our control. Your father is meeting today with his solicitors to discuss various matters. Until I receive more information, we shall maintain appearances as though nothing has changed. Margaret turned toward the door, then paused. You will remain in this house until further notice. You will receive no visitors. You will participate in no social engagements. Your behavior yesterday has attracted quite sufficient attention already. Confinement, it transpired, was remarkably simple to implement. Charlotte's mother merely positioned servants to prevent her daughter's departure from the townhouse. She was not locked in her chamber, yet the effect was identical to imprisonment. The days stretched with monotonous emptiness. Reading the same passages repeatedly without comprehension, staring from windows at the street below, consuming meals brought to her by staff members who maintained careful neutrality regarding her situation. It was Helena who discovered the mechanism for communication. On the third day of Charlotte's isolation, a delivery of flowers arrived with a card expressing sympathy for a fictional illness. The arrangement was brought to Charlotte's sitting room, and within the tightly wrapped stems lay a folded note written in Helena's distinctive handwriting. Are you being held captive? Your mother has turned away every caller this week. The society columns are absolutely vicious. One writer referred to your rejection as an act of feminine hysteria, masquerading as principle. I have been positioning myself near your street at different hours, hoping for a glimpse. Tomorrow, Mrs. Fairchild is attending the garden at Kew with her daughter. I convinced her to include a delivery of library books to your house. I will hide additional notes inside the volumes. Destroy them once read. We must maintain contact, or I shall go mad with worry. The letters that followed over subsequent days conveyed information that gradually became more troubling. Alexander had indeed departed London abruptly. He had been sighted in Manchester conducting business, though the nature of that business remained unclear. Society had largely moved past the scandal of his rejected proposal, which was simultaneously gratifying and somehow insulting. Her refusal of a duke was apparently not sufficiently extraordinary to sustain extended discussion. There were new scandals circulating now, new dramas to occupy the collective attention of the ton. More concerning was what Helena's letters revealed regarding Charlotte's father. The Viscount had received a formal accusation from several investors who had funded ventures with the understanding that their capital would be utilized in colonial enterprises of genuine merit. Instead, they had discovered that certain investments existed primarily in documentation rather than in actual commercial operations. The discrepancy was small enough to be arguably accidental, yet large enough to constitute fraud under the law. Margaret learned of this development on a Thursday afternoon, and Charlotte, positioned near her chamber door, heard her mother's response to the news through the floorboards, a series of sounds ranging from broken speech to what might have been the mother actually weeping. The Viscount's solicitor had warned him that criminal charges might follow. The family's reputation, already modest, faced genuine ruin. It was against this backdrop of accumulated crisis that Thomas Ashford appeared at the Hayes townhouse. He was received in the formal drawing room, and Charlotte observed from behind partially closed doors as her mother attempted to manage simultaneous social civility and barely concealed panic. Thomas was well dressed, his manner solicitous, his expression carrying precisely the degree of sympathetic concern that a cousin of the Duke might be expected to display toward a family facing adversity. I arrived in London only this morning and heard the most distressing rumours regarding your situation, Thomas said to Margaret, his voice containing calculated warmth. As a near relation to the Duke, I felt it my responsibility to ensure that if assistance might be offered, the family would not suffer from my neglecting to inquire. Margaret, desperate and gradually losing equilibrium, welcomed his attention entirely. She revealed details of the investment difficulties, the accusations, the threat to her husband's liberty. Thomas responded with sympathy that seemed genuine, with offers of advice that appeared helpful, with suggestions that perhaps the situation, while serious, was not entirely without remedy. I have certain connections, Thomas explained carefully. that might prove valuable in negotiations with these creditors. In exchange, of course, I would hope that your family might recognize my efforts with some show of gratitude. The nature of that gratitude became clearer when Thomas requested an audience with Charlotte. Margaret, in her desperation, agreed immediately, assuming that the Duke's cousin might convince Charlotte to reverse her previous refusal, or at minimum repair the family's standing through association with someone connected to the Ashford name. When Thomas was shown into the sitting room where Charlotte waited, he positioned himself with calculated casualness, his expression shifting into something approaching intimacy. He spoke about his concern for her situation, the difficulty she must be experiencing after her public humiliation, the way society could be so dreadfully harsh in its judgments. He suggested, almost offhandedly, that perhaps her refusal of his cousin had been prompted by uncertainty rather than genuine rejection of marriage itself. Perhaps, he offered delicately, she might discover that acceptance of his own attention could provide the emotional connection she desired while simultaneously addressing certain practical concerns her family currently faced. Charlotte understood, in that moment, precisely what Thomas was. Beneath his careful words and calculated concern lay a man who viewed her family's adversity as opportunity, who saw her vulnerability as leverage, who was offering salvation that came packaged with an entirely different form of captivity than the one her mother's control represented. "Your concern is noted, Mr. Ashford," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "But I must decline. My family's difficulties do not alter my convictions regarding marriage. Regardless of external circumstance, I will not enter into such an arrangement with anyone who approaches it as transaction rather than genuine partnership." Thomas's expression darkened fractionally before he recovered his pleasant mask. He departed shortly afterward, but not before making certain that Charlotte understood her refusal had consequences, that his willingness to assist her father's situation was contingent upon her demonstrating appropriate gratitude, which was to say, appropriate submission to his will. After he had gone, Charlotte returned to her confinement, but something had shifted. Her mother's crisis was her crisis. Her father's potential imprisonment had become real and terrifying, and the options available to her were narrowing significantly. Manchester proved an insufficient distance to escape the memory of Charlotte Hayes. Alexander Blackwell had arrived at his northern estate with the intention of losing himself in the management of textile mills and the paperwork that accompanied such enterprises, yet her face persisted. Those green eyes that had regarded him with more genuine consideration than most of London society combined. He found himself replaying their conversation obsessively, analysing each phrase, each expression, searching for evidence that her refusal had been anything other than absolute rejection of his proposal, and perhaps, of him personally. The obsession was entirely beneath his dignity. Alexander had never been a man accustomed to dwelling upon circumstances beyond his control. Control itself had been the defining characteristic of his life. Controlling his estates, controlling his social position, controlling the expectations and outcomes that surrounded him. Yet Charlotte Hayes had disrupted this fundamental aspect of his existence by refusing to be controlled, by declining the path he had meticulously arranged, by rejecting him with such conviction that it exposed the limitations of his power in the most humiliating manner imaginable. 3 weeks into his self-imposed exile, Alexander summoned a man named Nathaniel Price. Price was not the sort of individual one encountered in polite society. He was, by trade, an investigator, a man who gathered information through methods that ranged from conventional to questionable, depending upon what circumstances demanded. He had worked previously for various members of the aristocracy who required discretion in matters that could not be entrusted to conventional inquiry. "I require information regarding a particular family," Alexander explained, settling into the study of his Manchester residence. "The Hayes family, Viscount Hayes specifically, though his daughter may prove relevant to my inquiries." Price regarded him with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long since ceased to judge his employer's motivations. "The nature of the information you require, financial circumstances primarily, the family's current situation, their prospects, any matters that might be considered sensitive or problematic." Alexander paused. particularly in the last several months. I can conduct preliminary investigations within a fortnight, Price replied. For more comprehensive information, I may require additional time. Time is secondary to accuracy, Alexander instructed. I require thorough intelligence, not speculation. What Price uncovered over the subsequent weeks provided a portrait of financial deterioration far more severe than Alexander had anticipated. The Viscount's investments in colonial enterprises had proven substantially less lucrative than represented. Several investors had begun making inquiries that had transformed into accusations of misrepresentation. The discrepancies were small enough that they might constitute oversight rather than deliberate fraud, yet they were sufficiently substantial to attract the attention of solicitors and the threat of formal legal proceedings. This information reframed Alexander's entire understanding of Charlotte's refusal. She had rejected him not from indifference or principle alone, but from circumstances that had likely been deteriorating even as she stood in that ballroom. Had she known about the financial crisis? Had her refusal been motivated partly by awareness that accepting him while her family faced potential scandal might be viewed as strategic rather than genuine? The implications were simultaneously clarifying and troubling. He found himself uncertain whether this knowledge diminished or enhanced his obsession with discovering her true motivations. It was during this same period that Thomas Ashford arrived unexpectedly at Manchester. Alexander's cousin appeared periodically, ostensibly to discuss family matters or business interests, though his visits typically involved extended discussions of entertainments and social gossip with irritating frequency. This occasion followed that established pattern. Thomas arrived with news of London's scandals, society's latest intrigues, and information regarding various acquaintances. I encountered the most fascinating piece of intelligence regarding your recent acquaintance, Thomas said casually, settling into a chair with the presumption of extended conversation. The Hayes family appears to be experiencing considerable financial difficulties. The Viscount made several investments that have proven disastrous. There are rumors of potential legal action, creditors circling, the entire apparatus of aristocratic financial collapse. Alexander's attention sharpened immediately. How did you acquire this information? Society gossip primarily, Thomas replied with a smile that contained more edge than genuine warmth, though I confess I made inquiries when the extent of the situation became apparent. Rather dramatic circumstances, actually. One almost feels compelled to intervene. Does one not? Offer assistance to a family in such distress. You are not typically motivated by charitable impulses, Alexander observed flatly. What is the genuine nature of your interest? Thomas's expression shifted, becoming more carefully neutral. Merely family concern. After all, Miss Hayes is technically an acquaintance of the Ashford name through their connection to you. One hates to see such situations develop without offering whatever assistance might be available. Alexander did not believe this explanation for a moment. His cousin's motivations were fundamentally self-interested. Thomas appeared to be assessing whether Charlotte's family crisis might be transformable into some form of leverage or advantage. The realization triggered something in Alexander that felt remarkably like possessive fury. I trust, Alexander said coldly, that any assistance you offer will be appropriately motivated. Miss Hayes is not an appropriate object for manipulation, Thomas. I had not suggested otherwise, Thomas replied with studied innocence. Though I confess curiosity regarding your sudden protectiveness toward a woman who rejected your proposal. One might interpret such concern as suggesting your feelings extend beyond simple wounded pride. Alexander did not dignify this observation with response. After Thomas departed, however, he found himself reconsidering everything. Charlotte's financial circumstances had been precarious at the time of his proposal. She had refused him despite knowing, or perhaps because she knew, that acceptance might have solved her family's crisis. What did that say about her character? What motivation beyond principle could sustain such a refusal in the face of genuine adversity? He dismissed Price and returned alone to his study, where he remained through the night, contemplating a situation that had transformed from wounded pride into something substantially more complicated. For the first time since Charlotte's rejection, Alexander began to consider that perhaps his obsession was not merely wounded vanity. Perhaps it was something far more dangerous. the awareness that he had encountered a woman whose convictions might actually exceed his capacity to manipulate her through conventional means. The mills outside Manchester continued their operations. Business proceeded according to established protocols. Yet Alexander found himself increasingly distracted, his attention fragmenting between the present duties demanding his focus and the persistent memory of a woman who had refused to be anything other than entirely honest with him, regardless of the cost such honesty incurred. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a solicitor rather than through the usual channels of post. The Viscount's solicitor informed him that the fraudulent investment accusations had been resolved through compensation arrangements that had materialized seemingly from nowhere. The creditors had been satisfied. The legal threat had dissipated. The Viscount's liberty, which had appeared increasingly precarious, was suddenly secure. Margaret received this news with an expression oscillating between profound relief and mounting confusion. She demanded her husband explain the source of funds that had resolved their crisis, and when the Viscount proved unable to provide coherent answers beyond that certain individuals had intervened, she recognized the truth immediately. Someone with substantial resources and access to the financial mechanisms necessary for such intervention had taken action. Someone, moreover, had done so without seeking compensation or acknowledgement. It took Margaret approximately 2 hours to arrive at the conclusion that this intervention had originated with Alexander Blackwell. Her relief transformed into something considerably more complex. She had been saved from ruin, yes, but she had been saved by the man her daughter had publicly humiliated. She was, in the most fundamental sense, obligated to him. The family's security rested upon his continued goodwill and discretion. Margaret understood, with devastating clarity, that her family was no longer entirely autonomous, but rather dependent upon the whims of a duke who had demonstrated his capacity to manipulate circumstances with invisible precision. This realization manifested in a form of protective ferocity that exceeded even her customary control. Charlotte was removed from her confinement, brought downstairs, and positioned before her mother with an intensity that suggested imminent catastrophe. "You will understand," Margaret began, her voice maintaining superficial calm despite the fury evident in her posture, "that the resolution of your father's situation creates obligations that cannot be ignored. We are now indebted to the Duke of Ashford in ways that extend beyond mere financial calculation. Such debts demand repayment through appropriate channels." Charlotte understood what her mother was suggesting, though the implications were sufficiently dire that she required her mother to articulate them explicitly. "I am to accept a proposal from the Duke?" Charlotte asked quietly. "You are to ensure that any future proposal from that quarter receives the acceptance it should have received the first instance," Margaret replied coldly. "You rejected him once and nearly destroyed this family in the process. You will not repeat that error. If the Duke returns with a renewed proposal, your response will be affirmative. Is that sufficiently clear?" The cruelty of this demand struck Charlotte with particular force because she understood its logic. Her mother was not being unreasonable according to the calculus of their social position. She was protecting her family's interests through means that society would recognize as prudent and appropriate. Yet accepting such an arrangement would reduce Charlotte to exactly the position she had feared. A woman traded in exchange for economic security. Her agency surrendered entirely to obligation. It was during this same period that Thomas Ashford began conducting his own investigations into the mechanics of the Duke's intervention. He had approached a young maidservant in the Hayes household with both coin and promises, securing her agreement to report any communications regarding Charlotte. The maid, named Sarah, proved willing to betray her employer's confidences in exchange for financial compensation that exceeded her annual wages. Through this arrangement, Thomas discovered that Alexander had explicitly requested sight of Charlotte, that this request had been made through intermediaries rather than directly, and that there existed clear evidence of the Duke's continued investment in her welfare despite her rejection of his proposal. The information was sufficiently suggestive to support a narrative that had begun forming in Thomas's mind, a narrative regarding obligation, debt, and the mechanisms through which such obligations might be discharged. Alexander's return to London occurred on a rain-soaked afternoon in late autumn. He arrived at his townhouse with minimal fanfare, dismissing most of his staff and retaining only essential personnel. Within hours, he had dispatched a communication to the Hayes household, requesting an interview with Charlotte under circumstances that would preserve propriety and discretion. Margaret received this request with satisfaction. The Duke was making formal overtures, which suggested he was prepared to overlook the previous rejection and offer a renewed proposal. She dressed Charlotte in the finest gown remaining in their possession, positioned her in the formal drawing room, and withdrew with the precision of a stage manager, confirming all elements were prepared for performance. Alexander's arrival transformed the entire atmosphere of the Hayes drawing room. He carried himself with the same detached courtesy he had demonstrated at their initial encounter, yet something in his bearing suggested he was expending considerable effort toward maintaining this facade. He examined Charlotte with an intensity that suggested he was attempting to catalogue every change that months of stress and confinement might have produced. "I trust you have been well?" he inquired, his voice revealing nothing beyond formal concern. "As circumstances permit, Your Grace," Charlotte replied carefully. She was acutely aware that her mother remained positioned just beyond the drawing room door, capable of hearing everything despite the pretense of privacy. "I am grateful for your assistance regarding my family's situation. I understand that your intervention resolved difficulties that had threatened our security. I am merely pleased the matter could be addressed," Alexander replied. He paused, and Charlotte observed the tension in his jaw, the deliberate control he exercised over his expression. "Your father's investments, while regrettable in their outcome, were not substantially different from ventures many gentlemen undertake. The accusation of fraud was largely a matter of interpretation by individuals determined to recover their losses through legal means. Resolution was straightforward. This explanation was transparent fiction, and Charlotte recognized it as such. The Duke was providing her with language she could use to explain his intervention to her mother, without acknowledging the full extent of his manipulation of circumstances. He was, in effect, offering her a narrative that would allow her family to accept his assistance without confronting the implications of their dependence. "You are most kind," Charlotte said, and the words tasted like compromise. "I wish to see you," Alexander continued, and his voice shifted into something less controlled, "to confirm that you were not suffering unduly from the consequences of your previous decision. Your refusal of my proposal has resulted in circumstances that appear to have caused you significant distress." "My distress is my responsibility," Charlotte replied, and she saw something flicker in his expression at her tone. "I made my choice with full awareness of the potential consequences. I cannot allow that choice to be unmade by circumstance." "I have not suggested it should be," Alexander responded. "I merely wished to ensure you possessed understanding regarding certain matters. Your family is now secure through arrangements that will not require renewal or renegotiation, provided they remain undisturbed. You are free to make decisions regarding your future based on genuine preference rather than economic desperation." The implication was clear, though unstated. He had purchased her family's security without attaching explicit conditions, yet the obligation existed nonetheless. Charlotte was aware that her family's well-being now rested upon her relationship with the Duke of Ashford. What remained uncertain was whether Alexander understood this himself, or whether he had acted from motivations entirely separate from any expectation of future return. Outside the drawing room, Margaret pressed her ear against the door and heard nothing beyond fragments of conversation that provided insufficient evidence of the renewal of courtship she had anticipated. And in a modest room, not far from the Hayes townhouse, Thomas Ashford received his payment from Sarah the maidservant and began composing detailed accounts of the Duke's interactions with Charlotte, documentation that might prove extraordinarily valuable should circumstances develop in unexpected directions. The opportunity for escape presented itself on a Thursday afternoon, when Margaret received an invitation to join several acquaintances for a prolonged visit to the home of Lady Ashworth. The social engagement, designed specifically to re-establish Margaret's position within society after weeks of reduced visibility due to the family's crisis, consumed her attention entirely. She departed the townhouse with meticulous preparation. her focus devoted entirely to managing her appearance and her narrative regarding the family's recent difficulties. Helena arrived at the Hayes residence shortly after Margaret's carriage departed, moving through the household with the confidence of someone accustomed to accessing the residence. She carried with her a message written in Alexander's hand, delivered personally the previous day to her father's townhouse. The communication was brief and carefully worded. Alexander requested an interview with Charlotte to occur at a location removed from the scrutiny that surveillance of the Hayes household would inevitably produce. He offered specific times and a discreet location, the conservatory of the Botanical Gardens near Kew, a destination that would attract sufficient numbers of visitors to provide cover for their conversation, yet allow for privacy through strategic positioning among the plantings. He has been extraordinarily persistent, Helena confided, as she assisted Charlotte into a borrowed carriage. I have received 3 communications from him in the past weeks, each more carefully phrased than the last. He inquired whether you remained confined to the house. When I confirmed that you were essentially imprisoned by your mother, he determined a method to create circumstance sufficient for your escape. Charlotte's heart performed an erratic pattern as the carriage conveyed her toward Kew. She remained uncertain regarding the purpose of this meeting, though she harbored suspicions that extended beyond mere social conversation. Alexander had paid her family's debts. He had created the very circumstances that now held her captive to obligation. Whatever he desired to communicate surely extended beyond polite pleasantries. The conservatory was warm and humid, thick with the fragrance of exotic flowers and cultivated vegetation. Alexander stood positioned among towering palms, his posture suggesting he had been waiting for extended periods. He wore dark clothing despite the warmth of the space, and Charlotte observed that he had lost weight during the months of their separation. His features had become more austere, his expression more tightly controlled. "I am grateful you came," Alexander said without preamble. "Your friend was instrumental in arranging this meeting. I recognize the risk you undertake in departing your mother's supervision." "My mother is occupied with social engagement," Charlotte replied carefully. "We have limited time." "I am aware." He paused, and Charlotte observed the struggle evident in his posture, as he apparently composed whatever words he intended to speak. "I need to understand your reasons for the rejection you offered at the ball. The true reasons, not the explanations offered for society's consumption." Charlotte had anticipated this question, yet hearing it spoken aloud still produced anxiety. "I was frightened," she said finally. "You offered security and position and everything my mother had taught me to value. Yet you offered it based upon a single evening's acquaintance. I could not accept an arrangement that would require me to surrender my voice and my judgment to satisfy practical concerns. My mother has spent her entire life making precisely that compromise, and I have watched the consequences. I will not repeat her mistake." Alexander moved closer, yet his posture remained formal despite the increased proximity. "Your assessment of my motivations was not inaccurate. I did propose based primarily upon practicality. I required a wife who would manage my estates and present a unified front to society. I viewed marriage as transaction rather than partnership. You were correct to identify that and to refuse it." "Then why?" Charlotte asked. "Why intervene regarding my father's situation? Why arrange for my family's circumstances to be resolved? You could have simply remained in Manchester and allowed time to diminish the memory of the proposal." "Because," Alexander said, and his voice carried an edge of something that resembled pain, "I could not accept that your refusal was based upon indifference. I required understanding, whether you rejected me specifically or rejected the arrangement itself. When your father's situation became apparent, I recognized that your refusal in the face of his potential ruin suggested your convictions extended beyond self-interest. That knowledge transformed my understanding of you entirely." He turned away, and Charlotte observed that he was exercising considerable effort toward maintaining composure. "What I initially identified as wounded pride transformed into something considerably more complicated. I became obsessed with understanding you. That obsession revealed that I had constructed a cage, Charlotte, and attempted to place you within it. Your rejection forced me to confront that. and forced me to recognize what motivated that obsession was not wounded vanity, but something far more dangerous. Which is, Charlotte whispered, the awareness that you are the first person I have encountered who cannot be controlled through conventional means. You cannot be purchased. You cannot be manipulated through obligation. You cannot be threatened into compliance. You possess something I have never encountered in anyone: the capacity to remain entirely yourself regardless of circumstance. He finally turned to face her fully. I recognize this because I have spent my entire existence cultivating the opposite capacity in myself. I have learned to control every impulse, every emotion, every response. Meeting someone who possessed your authenticity was simultaneously terrifying and profoundly compelling. Charlotte's throat constricted as she processed his words. You paid my father's debts to secure my gratitude. No, Alexander replied, with surprising vehemence. I paid them because your family faced ruin, as a direct consequence of your refusal to accept an arrangement that your mother would have gladly accepted. I could not allow my actions to result in your suffering. That motivation had nothing to do with securing your gratitude, and everything to do with resolving my own culpability. My mother now believes I am obligated to accept your next proposal, Charlotte said quietly. I know. He moved to the window and gazed out at the gardens beyond. Your mother's change in circumstances is directly attributable to my intervention. She has positioned you as my debt, as though your acceptance of a proposal would constitute appropriate repayment. She is not incorrect in identifying the obligation, though she is incorrect in assuming I will demand its discharge through marriage. What then? Charlotte asked, though she was uncertain she wanted to hear the answer. I would like to know you, Alexander said, turning back to her. Genuinely, without artifice or expectation. I would like to understand your thoughts on literature and philosophy and architecture, without calculating how such knowledge might be utilized to influence you. I would like to speak with you regarding my own uncertainties and fears, without requiring that you respond with deference to my position or status. I would like, in short, to discover whether genuine partnership might exist between us, rather than attempting to construct one through external manipulation. Charlotte heard footsteps in the corridor adjacent to the conservatory, the approach of other visitors drawn to the gardens despite the late hour. Alexander recognized the sounds simultaneously and moved to establish distance between them, positioning himself among the foliage in a manner that suggested casual observation of plantings rather than intimate conversation. They exchanged no further words during the remainder of the visit. Yet as Charlotte departed Kew, her mind remained occupied with the implications of what Alexander had articulated. He was offering not marriage but genuine acquaintance. He was attempting to constrain his own impulses rather than expand his control over her. Whether such constraint would prove sustainable, or whether it constituted merely temporary performance, remained to be determined. What was certain was that Margaret would require explanation for Charlotte's absence. The fabricated illness story would provide temporary cover, yet sustained escapes would eventually be detected. And when Margaret discovered the truth regarding Charlotte's contact with Alexander, her response would render continued confinement or worse absolutely certain. The conflict that had been building throughout the past months was approaching its inevitable culmination. The weeks that followed the encounter at Kew established a pattern of intricate deception that Charlotte executed with increasing sophistication. Margaret, satisfied that her daughter remained fundamentally under control despite the family's salvation, gradually relaxed her vigilance. She attended various social functions, positioning herself in drawing rooms across London, re-establishing connections that had momentarily wavered when questions regarding the family's financial stability had circulated. This expansion of Charlotte's permitted activities provided precisely the openings necessary for sustained contact with Alexander. Helena proved invaluable to these arrangements. She positioned herself as intermediary and accomplice, her loyalties entirely committed to her friend's well-being. She communicated meeting times through carefully encrypted notes hidden within library volumes. She arranged diversions that would occupy Margaret's attention during periods when Charlotte claimed minor ailments or social obligations that required her presence at various locations throughout the city. They selected venues that appeared coincidental rather than deliberately arranged. Galleries where both happened to be observing paintings, botanical gardens where they might encounter one another by apparent accident, architecture exhibitions that attracted sufficient numbers of visitors to provide necessary cover for conversation. During these encounters occurring over several weeks, Alexander revealed dimensions of himself that his position typically required him to conceal entirely. He spoke of the oppressive weight accompanying the management of vast estates, spanning multiple counties, the isolation inherent in his title, the solitude that accompanied being the sole individual responsible for decisions affecting hundreds of dependents. He articulated vulnerabilities and uncertainties with a candor that suggested how much effort such admission cost him. He confessed that his obsession with Charlotte had exposed limitations in his character that he had previously refused to acknowledge. He described the experience of discovering that control itself could become a prison. That power without someone to challenge it became meaningless. Charlotte, gradually permitting him deeper access to her internal struggles, articulated the profound difficulty of maintaining conviction regarding personal agency when society insisted that her value derived entirely from her marital prospects. She acknowledged her fear that accepting any relationship would result in dissolution of self, the gradual submersion of identity that she had witnessed claim her mother entirely. She described her mother's transformation from a woman of considerable intelligence and spirit into someone whose existence revolved entirely around managing her husband's affairs and advancing her daughter's positions. Yet she also confessed that her resistance to Alexander had transformed into something considerably more complicated, a genuine desire for partnership that extended far beyond mere survival or practical convenience. These conversations established an intimacy that transcended physical proximity. They were learning one another gradually, with patience for inevitable misunderstanding, with willingness to revise initial assumptions as new information emerged. What Charlotte observed repeatedly was that Alexander's attempt to constrain his controlling impulses was not simply performance designed to impress her. He genuinely struggled against his own nature, repeatedly catching himself before issuing directives, consciously soliciting her preferences before assuming he possessed the right to make decisions affecting her life. It was this genuine vulnerability that Thomas Ashford identified as exploitable opportunity. Through Sarah the maidservant, who reported Charlotte's comings and goings with meticulous detail in exchange for coin that exceeded her annual wages substantially, Thomas began assembling comprehensive documentation of the frequency and duration of their meetings. He employed additional servants positioned strategically near various locations throughout London to provide detailed descriptions of interactions between Charlotte and Alexander. Through carefully orchestrated inquiries conducted at clubs and among business associates, he discovered that Helena possessed family connections facilitating the meetings. The information accumulated gradually, transforming from disconnected observations into a comprehensive narrative that Thomas proceeded to reshape into something far more damaging than mere private acquaintance. Thomas approached Lord Wetherby, a man known for his loose tongue and his desire to be regarded as possessed of inside knowledge regarding society's most intimate affairs. He provided carefully selected details regarding Charlotte's frequent absences, the Duke's documented payments to the Hayes family, the convenient timing of financial resolution coinciding with Charlotte's sudden increase in freedom. He suggested interpretations without stating them directly, allowing Wetherby's own imagination to complete the narrative. He suggested, through carefully chosen phrases, that perhaps the Duke had purchased not merely the family's financial security, but something considerably more intimate. The story emerged gradually through London's gossip networks, spreading with the inexorable momentum of scandal that fed upon society's predilection for salacious interpretation. Charlotte Hayes, the woman who had rejected the Duke of Ashford at the height of society during the season's most prestigious gathering, was his secret lover. More provocatively, she was discharging a debt incurred through her father's financial misadventures through means that were substantially more intimate than mere financial transaction. The Duke, it was suggested, with increasingly explicit implications, had purchased her compliance through payment of family debts, and Charlotte, recognizing obligation when confronted with it, had surrendered her virtue in compensation. The narrative was sufficiently rooted in observable fact to appear credible despite lacking explicit evidence. They did meet frequently. Alexander had indeed paid the family's debts. Charlotte had been confined and then suddenly permitted increased freedom. These elements of truth provided foundation for speculation that rapidly metastasized into assumed certainty. Variations proliferated through different social circles, each embellishment rendering the story more scandalous, each retelling adding details that had not existed in previous versions. Margaret learned the full extent of the accusations through a visit from Lady Ashworth, a woman whose social position granted her access to the most exclusive drawing rooms. She arrived ostensibly bearing sympathy, but genuinely intending to deliver gossip with maximum impact and witness the target's reaction directly. She spoke in hushed tones about the whispers, the suggestions, the implications spreading rapidly through society. She expressed ostensible concern for Charlotte's reputation, while simultaneously elaborating upon the specific accusations with remarkable detail. The transformation in Margaret's expression as the implications became clear to her was something Charlotte would never forget. Her mother's face flushed first with comprehension, then with fury that seemed to consume her entirely, consuming everything else in its path. Margaret's entire body seemed to rigidify as she processed what such accusations meant for her family's position. "You have destroyed this family," Margaret whispered, though her voice carried the intensity of a scream despite its reduced volume. "Not merely through your own ruin, but through association with the Duke. Society will assume we orchestrated this arrangement deliberately, that we sold you deliberately to address our financial circumstances. Your sisters' marriages will be questioned retroactively. Your father will be regarded as having sold his daughter's virtue in exchange for financial recovery. The accusations are entirely false," Charlotte attempted to explain, but Margaret silenced her with a gesture of pure contempt. "False or true, it does not matter anymore. Society believes it or is inclined to believe it sufficiently. That constitutes truth for purposes of social judgment in this world." Margaret began pacing the drawing room with agitation that suggested her mind was functioning with considerable rapidity through potential consequences and possible responses to those consequences. "You will deny everything publicly. You will declare that your meetings with the Duke were innocent and that society's interpretation reflects its own corruption rather than any impropriety on your part. You will do this tomorrow evening at the Ashworth reception, where these rumours originated." "And if I refuse?" Charlotte asked quietly. "If you refuse," Margaret replied coldly, her voice steady despite its danger. "Then, you will deny this tomorrow," Margaret said, voice like glass. "You will call the meetings innocent and the story vile. If you defy me, I will cut you off entirely. Carriage allowance servant's name. You will quit this house before the week is out." The evening before the Ashworth reception, Price requested a discreet audience. He laid out affidavits, ledgers, and a signed statement from a footman who had witnessed Thomas pressing coin into Sarah's hand. "Weatherby will repeat whatever sounds most like scandal," Price said evenly. "If confronted with sworn testimony and the threat of a magistrate's notice, he will recant." Alexander disliked the theatre of such exposure, but he disliked Charlotte's ruin far more. They agreed. Clarity, not spectacle. Witnesses enough to make retreat impossible. The ballroom of the Ashworth residence fell silent as Charlotte Hayes entered. The assembled guests recognized immediately that something extraordinary was occurring. She moved through the crowd with deliberate purpose, her posture radiating a determination that seemed to transform the air surrounding her. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, chosen not for its fashionability, but for its color, a statement of intention rather than a plea for forgiveness. Every eye tracked her progress toward the center of the ballroom, where Lord Ashworth stood in apparent confusion regarding what was transpiring. Charlotte ascended the small platform upon which the orchestra typically positioned itself during intermissions. From this vantage point, she possessed visibility to the entire assembled gathering. She drew breath, her heart executing patterns that suggested it might abandon its function entirely. "I have requested this audience because I have permitted silence to substitute for truth for far too long," Charlotte began, her voice steady, despite the tumult occurring within her. "I am aware that certain accusations regarding my character have circulated through society with remarkable persistence. I am aware that these accusations suggest I have engaged in impropriety with the Duke of Ashford. I am aware that many of you have accepted these assertions as factual without requiring evidence or verification. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret stood frozen near the refreshment table, her face draining of colour as she comprehended what her daughter was undertaking. "I will not clear my name by pleading innocence alone," Charlotte said, steady. "I will state the truth plainly and let it stand. I refused the Duke when he offered a role without regard for my heart. Later, when my family faced ruin, he set that ruin aside without purchase, condition, or claim upon me. Since then, we have met in public rooms and crowded gardens, not to bargain, but to speak, about books, work, fear, and the shape of a life honestly shared. If you call that impropriety, then the fault lies not in our conduct, but in your hunger for a cheaper story." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "What I will not accept is that such genuine connection should be characterized as transaction or obligation or anything other than what it genuinely represents, two individuals discovering one another without pretense or performance. If society wishes to condemn me for pursuing authenticity, I accept that condemnation. I will not diminish what I have found in exchange for society's approval." The silence following her declaration seemed absolute. Charlotte stepped down from the platform, uncertain whether she had accomplished salvation or merely expedited her own destruction. It was then that the crowd parted. Alexander appeared, his expression containing an intensity that seemed to consume everything around him. He moved directly toward Charlotte, unconcerned with propriety or observation. He took her hand, raising it as though in formal greeting, yet the gesture contained something profoundly intimate. "Miss Hayes has spoken truth," Alexander said, his voice carrying without strain. "I once mistook marriage for arrangement. She taught me it must be partnership." He faced her fully. "I do renew my proposal, not the one I made in folly, but one remade with respect. No bargain, no debt, no cage." He did not kneel. He did not perform. He opened his hand to show a plain gold band. "Charlotte Hayes, will you marry me, freely, and with me as your equal?" She looked from the ring to the man and found no terms hidden in his eyes. "Yes," she said, and the room heard it. Charlotte looked at the assembled crowd, then back to Alexander. "Yes," she whispered, though the words seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. "Yes, absolutely yes." At the edge of the crowd, Lord Weatherby cleared his throat, colour draining from his face as Price set a neat packet of papers upon the refreshment table. "Affidavits," Price said for those nearest to hear, "and receipts for coin paid to a maid named Sarah, with notes carried under Lord Thomas Ashford's seal. I have also lodged copies with a magistrate should these vanish." Weatherby, eager to be first in any new direction, stammered an apology, then named Thomas as his source. Eyes turned. Doors did not. Thomas moved, but found no path through the ring of suddenly attentive peers. Margaret remained frozen, her expression cycling through emotions that suggested she was processing the complete inversion of her anticipated narrative. Her daughter, whom she had threatened with disassociation mere hours previously, had instead claimed public agency. Charlotte had positioned herself not as a woman requiring society's forgiveness, but as someone who had acted according to genuine conviction. More significantly, she had secured not merely acceptance, but genuine recognition of her character and worth. As the evening concluded, society had undergone a fundamental reorientation. Thomas Ashford was in the process of being effectively expelled from respectable circles. Alexander Blackwell was no longer the rejected man nursing wounded pride, but rather someone capable of genuine transformation. And Charlotte Hayes had ceased being invisible. She had become the woman who had refused a duke, maintained her principles despite extraordinary pressure, and ultimately transformed that refusal into something far more meaningful than any acceptance could have produced. The chapel at Ashford House was modest in scale, yet distinguished in its simplicity. Charlotte stood within its stone walls on a morning when winter light filtered through tall windows, illuminating the space with ethereal clarity. The ceremony itself contained none of the elaborate performance that society typically demanded from ducal marriages. Instead of hundreds of guests arranged to observe, only essential witnesses attended, Helena positioned near the altar, with tears streaming down her face, the Viscount standing with restored dignity beside his daughter, Nathaniel Price representing Alexander's business interests, and a handful of close associates whom Alexander had deemed worthy of witnessing their vows. Charlotte wore white silk that fell with elegant simplicity, unadorned except for a single strand of pearls that had belonged to Alexander's mother. The gown possessed no elaborate train or excessive embroidery, merely refined elegance that reflected Charlotte's own preferences rather than society's expectations. She had insisted upon this level of restraint, and Alexander, demonstrating his commitment to honoring her agency, had supported every decision regarding the ceremony's arrangements without attempting to impose his own preferences or require adherence to conventional protocol. Alexander waited at the altar, wearing formal black tailcoat with minimal ornamentation. When Charlotte approached, his expression transformed into something that suggested the entire world had narrowed to only this moment and her presence within it. There existed no performance in his regard, no calculation of social effect. There was only genuine recognition of the woman walking toward him and the significance of what they were about to undertake together. The vows they exchanged were not the standardized phrases society expected. Instead, they had composed their own words, articulating their individual commitments with specificity that acknowledged their history and their chosen future. Alexander acknowledged his past tendency toward control and his commitment to permitting Charlotte genuine partnership in decisions affecting their lives. Charlotte articulated her own commitment to authentic connection rather than retreat into protected isolation. They promised not romance in the conventional sense, but genuine partnership based upon mutual respect and willingness to continue learning one another throughout their lives together. The ring Alexander placed upon her finger was the same gold band she had worn since the Ashworth ball. Simple, elegant, bearing no inscription, because neither of them believed permanent words could adequately capture what existed between them. What was permanent was the daily choice to honor one another's agency and authenticity. Following the ceremony, Charlotte and Alexander departed for Ashford House in Kent, the principal ducal estate. They travelled with minimal retinue and no ceremonial fanfare. The journey itself seemed designed for conversation rather than display, and as their carriage conveyed them toward their new life together, they discussed the future with the practical consideration that had come to characterize their relationship. During the months that followed their marriage, transformation occurred throughout the Ashford estates and holdings. Charlotte discovered that assuming the role of Duchess did not require surrendering her opinions or becoming an ornament within Alexander's existing structure. Instead, she exercised genuine influence over decisions affecting household management, tenant welfare, and estate development. When she suggested improvements to the cottage's housing workers on the property, Alexander implemented her recommendations without requiring justification beyond her conviction that they were necessary. When she advocated for increased investment in local agricultural development, he consulted with her regarding strategy rather than dismissing her involvement as inappropriate to her position. The Viscount, his reputation restored and his financial circumstances permanently secured through Alexander's continued management of his investments, gradually re-established himself within society circles that had momentarily questioned his integrity. He divided his time between the townhouse in London and periods at Ashford House, where he discovered genuine contentment in a quieter existence focused upon reading, correspondence with old friends, and observation of his daughter's transformation into a woman of genuine authority and influence. Helena was formally recognized as Charlotte's lady-in-waiting, a position that carried not merely ceremonial significance, but represented genuine partnership. She participated in decisions regarding the household and estates, her loyalty and competence earning her both compensation and authority that exceeded what society typically granted to women in such positions. The friendship that had sustained Charlotte through crisis and confinement became publicly acknowledged and formalized. Nathaniel Price, the investigator who had served Alexander with such discretion and effectiveness, discovered himself offered permanent employment, overseeing security and administrative matters for the Ashford holdings. His work, previously conducted in shadow and requiring discretion, became recognized and valued in ways that allowed him genuine advancement and security. Alexander ensured that his contributions to resolving the scandal regarding Thomas Ashford received appropriate acknowledgement. 6 months after their marriage, Charlotte discovered that she was carrying a child. She learned this information while positioned in the library at Ashford House, reading volumes regarding history and philosophy in the same manner she had engaged with them before marriage. Her life had not fundamentally altered in its essential character. She remained an individual who valued knowledge and authentic connection. Marriage had expanded her sphere of influence rather than contracting it. As autumn approached and pregnancy advanced noticeably, Charlotte retreated to the library during afternoon hours when weak sunlight suggested the season's transition toward winter. She positioned herself in a leather chair positioned near the windows that overlooked the extensive gardens at Ashford House. Her advancing pregnancy rendered her somewhat uncomfortable with extended periods of standing, and the library had become her refuge for quiet contemplation. It was during one such afternoon that Alexander discovered her there. He had returned from conducting business regarding estate matters earlier than anticipated and had been informed by servants that his wife occupied the library. He entered quietly, uncertain whether she was sleeping, and found her awake but absorbed in reading, her hand positioned protectively over her swollen abdomen. Charlotte glanced up as he approached, and her expression transformed into genuine pleasure at his presence. She marked her page carefully before setting the volume aside, permitting him to settle into the chair positioned adjacent to hers. He reached over and placed his hand over hers, feeling the subtle movements of the child they had created together, physical evidence of their partnership developing into something entirely new. "The tenant cottage renovations are progressing according to your specifications," Alexander said, speaking as he had learned to speak with her, consulting rather than declaring, acknowledging her continued interest in matters she had championed. "The workers report that your modifications regarding ventilation have improved conditions considerably. Several families have expressed gratitude for the improvements. I am pleased," Charlotte replied, squeezing his hand gently. "I had hoped the changes would prove practical rather than merely aesthetic. A home should function well for those inhabiting it, not merely present an acceptable appearance to external observers." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light shift across the gardens. Outside the library windows, the property that Charlotte would help govern as Duchess continued its seasonal transitions. The renovated cottages housed families that would benefit from her advocacy for their welfare. The estate itself functioned under principles that she had influenced despite not possessing the legal authority to do so. She had discovered that genuine influence required neither title nor formal authority. It required only the willingness to articulate vision and the fortune of possessing a partner willing to implement her recommendations. "I had not anticipated this," Charlotte said quietly, and Alexander recognized that she was speaking about their entire relationship rather than merely this moment in the library. "When I rejected you at that ball, I could not have predicted how fundamentally my life would transform. I could not have anticipated discovering genuine partnership with someone I initially perceived only as embodying everything I feared. Nor could I have predicted that rejection would become the defining moment of my existence," Alexander replied, his fingers intertwining with hers gently. "You have taught me that genuine strength does not emerge from control, but from the capacity to permit oneself and others the agency to make authentic choices. Everything I am now has emerged from the consequences of your refusal of my initial proposal." The light continued its gradual shift. The child within Charlotte moved again, responding to their touch and their voices in ways neither of them fully understood, but both of them recognized as profound connection. Their life together, which had begun in dramatic rejection and proceeded through scandal and confrontation, had evolved into something remarkably quiet and genuine. It was this quietness, the absence of performance, the simplicity of authentic partnership, that constituted their greatest victory. Charlotte had rejected a duke and discovered that what she had actually been rejecting was false versions of herself and false versions of connection. What she had discovered instead was the possibility of genuine existence alongside someone willing to permit her to remain entirely herself.